President of the United States is the leader of this great and powerful country. But the President is a person, and the leaders of other countries are persons. And the fact that the elder George Bush knew personally most of the leaders of the other great powers and many other countries as well was absolutely essential in gaining the trust that was necessary for the Cold War to end the way it did. George W. Bush had had a relatively undistinguished political career before he became president. He'd been elected to Congress from Texas. He ran for the Senate, but lost. He then climbed the appointive ladder. He was America's first envoy to China. This was absolutely crucial because at that point he got to know Deng Xiaoping and the other members of the Chinese leadership. So in response to the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989, when the American press, the American media, American politicians of all stripes were urging the president to express America's great outrage at the suppression of this democracy movement, George Bush knew enough to play it low-key. He sent Brent Scowcroft quietly and secretly to Beijing, explaining that this was not something that the United States approved, but that he was not going to allow this to derail the positive developments in Chinese politics and economics. And another president, a president more prone to grandstanding, might have made the situation far worse. China has developed remarkably over the subsequent 15, 18 years, to the point where China is, well, by some people, even threatening American power. But the kind of threat that China poses today is nothing like the threat that China was thought to pose during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. China has become a member of the capitalist world. And no one could have guessed in the 1960s, my God, in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, for heaven's sakes, that China would become a card-carrying member of the World Trade Organization. Good heavens. This is the best the United States could hope for. When George Bush decided to side with Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, behind the unification of Germany, this was something that was widely seen as foolish, as unpopular. The British were against it. The Russians were against it. Nearly every other European country was against it. The only one for it besides the Germans was George Bush. And George Bush quietly and gently made it happen. So that Germany, far from being the problem child of European and world affairs as it had been since the 1870s, now became securely tied in to the European Union. So, and he did a lot of this on the telephone. He did it because people trusted George Bush. And they knew he wasn't going to take political advantage of the concessions that they would make. So this is where the personal really does intersect the political and the international. And it does show how presidents and presidential personalities can play a huge role. One last thing, and then I think we got to go, but one last thing I want to say about this is the elder George Bush's secret of political success was something that your mother or your grandmother taught you in kindergarten. And that is the importance of being nice and polite. And I'll just tell you one story, because George Bush, before he was president, before he was vice president, among his other positions was director of Central Intelligence. He was head of the CIA. And he got to know various station chiefs, CIA station chiefs in American embassies around the world. And whenever he would visit those embassies, either as CIA director or as vice president or as president, he would make a point of carving 5 or 10 minutes out of his schedule. And when you're president, it's hard to carve out that kind of time, to talk to the station chief and just ask them one-on-one, what do you need? Is there anything I can do for you? What can I do to make your job easier? And when he got back to the United States, and this is what your grandmother taught you in kindergarten part, he took time to write personal notes written in his own hand, just a note saying, thanks for all the good work you did. And I have spoken to a whole lot of CIA, American government officials, who cherish those notes. And when they tell me about this, they almost get tears in their eyes. I had the good fortune of being at the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, which used to be just called CIA headquarters. And well, originally it wasn't called anything because it wasn't supposed to exist and nobody was supposed to know it was there. But when 7,000 people every day drove in, eventually you caught on that something's happening there. In the late 1990s, I think maybe it was 1997, it was renamed the George Bush Center for Intelligence. And because I was on the board of the Bush School, I got an invitation. This is great. This is the only time I'm ever going to get inside the CIA headquarters. And so I went. And there was such a response for former President Bush at this time, the only president ever to have been head of the CIA. There was such respect and downright love for George Bush among all those intelligence officers that the biggest auditorium in the building wasn't big enough to hold all the people who wanted to attend this ceremony. It was just a renaming ceremony, for heaven's sake. And so they had to bring in this huge tent, this great circus tent, that they put up on the lawn outside the front of the building. And even then, they had to draw straws to see who of everybody, because everybody wanted to go, to see who could go. And I happened to be in the section that was set aside for the outside visitors. And it was the most astonishing thing when we were all just sort of sitting there, waiting for something to happen. And then, without a word, it became apparent that former President Bush was walking in from the rear. And immediately as he did, all of those employees of the CIA, all those intelligence officers, including former cabinet members, people who'd worked with Bush, as a person, they just leaped up and gave him this standing ovation that just lasted and lasted and lasted. It was the most moving experience I've ever had of this kind of respect, admiration, even love for their former chief. And it just goes to show that if you take the time to do what your grandmother told you to do, you can go very far. How are we on time? Do we need to go? Okay. Thanks very much.